August 14th, 1971. The heat pressed down on the back of Lorraine Mitchell's neck like a wool blanket soaked in bathwater. She was 30 years old, standing at the rear of a farm equipment auction outside Hays, Kansas, with her 2-year-old daughter Colleen balanced on her left hip. The girl's weight had become familiar over the months, a constant pull on Lorraine's lower back that she no longer noticed except when she set her down and felt the sudden lightness. Colleen's cheek rested against her mother's collarbone, sticky with sweat and the juice from the peach Lorraine had given her 20 minutes earlier to keep her quiet. Ahead of them, maybe 40 yards through a sea of men in worn denim and faded caps, a blue and yellow combine rolled into the sale ring. The auctioneer's voice crackled through speakers mounted on wooden posts, words tumbling over each other too fast for Lorraine to parse. She didn't know much about combines then. Didn't know a header from a thresher couldn't tell you what horsepower meant in practical terms. But she knew machinery when she saw it, and this one looked new enough to matter. Clayton stood next to his father, Vernon, both of them motionless in a way that made her uneasy. Vernon's hands were shoved deep in the pockets of his khaki work pants, shoulders slightly hunched despite the heat. Clayton's posture was different, straighter. His right hand hung at his side, fingers flexing open and closed like he was working, feeling back into them after gripping something too long. Lorraine had seen that look in her husband's eyes before. That certainty. That conviction that this moment, this decision was going to change everything. She'd seen it the night he proposed, standing in her parents' living room in Kansas City with his hair slicked back and his good shirt buttoned to the collar. She'd seen it the morning they drove out to the farm for the first time as a married couple, his hands steady on the wheel as he explained how they'd make it work. And she saw it now in the set of his jaw, in the way he leaned forward just slightly as the combine came to a stop in the center of the ring. Vernon's jaw was set too, but differently. Lorraine recognized that expression from Sunday dinners at the big farmhouse a quarter mile down the road from the smaller one she and Clayton lived in. It was the look Vernon wore when someone at church asked about expansion plans, or when the county extension agent stopped by to talk about new fertilizer methods. A quiet, unmovable no that he never had to say out loud because his face said it for him. The auctioneer pointed at the combine with a long wooden stick. His voice rose and fell in that sing-song rhythm Lorraine still hadn't gotten used to after 2 years of living in farm country. Numbers flew past. 12,000. 13. She shifted Colleen to her other hip and tried to see Clayton's face, but too many men stood between them. 15,200. The bidding slowed. Lorraine could feel it even from the back, the way the energy in the crowd changed when serious money started getting thrown around. She counted maybe 3 people still in it. One of them was a woman in a denim jacket standing near the front. Lorraine couldn't see the others. 16,800. The auctioneer's stick swept toward the woman. His voice stretched the numbers out, making them sound bigger than they were. Silence dropped over the auction yard. Just the distant sound of a diesel engine idling somewhere behind the equipment sheds, and closer the shuffle of boots and gravel. Clayton's right hand came up. Not all the way. Just lifted from his side fingers, straightening, rising to about the level of his belt buckle. Vernon turned his head. Slow, deliberate. The kind of movement that took effort to keep controlled. He looked at his son, and even from 40 yards back with half the county standing between them, Lorraine felt the weight of that look, felt it land on Clayton like something physical. Clayton's hand lowered, not dropped, not jerked back, just descended smoothly to his side as if the thought of raising it had never crossed his mind. The woman in the denim jacket got the combine for $16,800. The auctioneer's voice shifted to the next item, something about a grain cart, and the crowd began to shift and resettle. Lorraine watched Clayton walk toward the parking area without looking back at his father. Vernon followed a few minutes later, his gait, unhurried hands still in his pockets. The drive home took 40 minutes. Lorraine sat in the back seat of the truck with Colleen on her lap, watching the back of her husband's head. Clayton drove. Vernon sat passenger side, staring out the window at fields that all looked the same to Lorraine, flat expanses of wheat stubble stretching to horizons that seemed impossibly far away and impossibly close at the same time. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the truck's engine, a low, steady rumble that filled the cab, and occasionally Colleen's small voice asking when they'd be home. That night, after Clayton had gone out to check on something in the machine shed, Lorraine sat at their kitchen table with the window cracked open to let in whatever cooling the evening might bring. The house was a 2-bedroom farmhouse built sometime in the 1920s with wood floors that creaked under every step and a bathroom so small you had to close the door to sit on the toilet. The kitchen table was metal with a white enamel top that had chipped in 3 places along the edge. She ran her finger over the largest chip while Colleen played with wooden blocks on the floor nearby. When Clayton came back in his boots, heavy on the porch steps, she asked what happened. His voice came out flat, tired. He wouldn't let me bid. She waited, but he didn't elaborate. Just stood there in the doorway with his hands hanging loose at his sides, looking at the floor between them. Why, I don't know. He never explains, just says no. He crossed to the sink, ran water, drank from his cupped hands. Lorraine watched his shoulders, the way they stayed rigid even when he straightened up and turned around. She wanted to go to him, put her arms around him the way she used to when they were first married. But something in the air between them felt brittle, fragile in a way that made her afraid moving might break it completely. He went upstairs without saying anything else. She heard the bed frame creak when he lay down. Later, after she'd put Colleen to bed and washed the dinner dishes and swept the kitchen floor, she climbed the stairs and found him still awake, staring at the ceiling in the dark. She lay down beside him. He didn't move. She reached for his hand. He let her take it, but his fingers didn't curl around hers. Something broke between them that day. Not completely. Not in a way that made noise or left visible damage. But a crack formed hairline thin, and Lorraine felt it there in the silence of their bedroom, in the space between his body and hers. The story started earlier than that auction, though. Started 2 years before, in the spring of 1969, when Lorraine Abbott became Lorraine Mitchell in a small ceremony at the Methodist Church in Kansas City. She was 28 then. Late to marry by the standards of most of her friends, but she'd had her reasons for waiting. Wanted to finish college. Wanted to teach for a few years, build some independence, see if she could make her own way before tying herself to someone else's life. She'd met Clayton at a church social the summer after her graduation from Kansas State. He was visiting relatives in the city, stood near the punch bowl, looking uncomfortable in dress slacks and a tie that sat slightly crooked at his collar. She'd noticed his hands first, strong scarred across the knuckles in ways that spoke of outdoor work. When he introduced himself, his voice was quiet, steady. He talked about farming, the way other men talked about baseball or politics, with a kind of certainty that made it sound like the only thing worth doing. Her parents worried. Not about Clayton specifically. He was polite, respectful, showed up on time when he said he would. But farming, that was different. Her mother pulled her aside one evening after Clayton had driven back to Hayes. "It's hard work, Lorraine, harder than you think." "I know, Mama. Your teaching is good work. Steady. You have your degree. You could build a career." Lorraine didn't argue, didn't try to explain that she loved Clayton in a way that made career considerations feel small and distant. She just nodded and let her mother worry, because that's what mothers did. They married in April. By May, Lorraine had quit her teaching position at Northeast Elementary, packed her belongings into 4 cardboard boxes and 2 suitcases, and moved to a farm 3 hours west of everything she'd known. The farmhouse Clayton took her to was smaller than she'd imagined. The bathroom had a clawfoot tub with rust stains under the faucet and a mirror that had gone cloudy around the edges. The kitchen stove was gas, the kind you had to light with a match. No dishwasher. The washing machine sat on the back porch, a Ringer model that Lorraine had only seen in photographs. Vernon and Estelle lived in the bigger farmhouse a quarter-mile up the road. Lorraine met them properly the day after she and Clayton returned from a 2-night honeymoon in Abilene. Estelle was 51, then a small woman with gray hair she kept pinned back and hands that moved constantly, wiping, folding, adjusting, never still. She showed Lorraine how to work the gas stove where Clayton kept the tools for the garden plot behind the house, which drawer held the canning supplies left over from the previous tenant. She was kind, polite, but there was distance in her kindness, a reserve that Lorraine couldn't quite identify at first. Not coldness, exactly. More like the careful courtesy you'd extend to a guest you weren't sure would be staying long. Vernon spoke even less than his wife. Lorraine would see him in the evenings when he and Clayton came in from the fields, dirt ground into the creases of his face, his eyes the color of winter sky. He'd nod to her, ask if she was settling in all right. She'd say yes, and that would be the end of it. Learning to be a farm wife meant learning 100 small things nobody thought to teach you until you needed them. How to cook for harvest crews. 15 men who'd eat 3 times their weight in roast beef and mashed potatoes if you let them. How to preserve vegetables from the garden jars and jars of green beans and tomatoes and pickles lined up in the cellar where it stayed cool, even in August. How to collect eggs without getting pecked by the hens. How to tell when bread dough had risen enough. How to stretch a dollar so far it seemed to multiply in your hands. Estelle taught her most of it. Stood beside her in that hot kitchen showing her how to seal jar lids properly, how to tell when the pressure in the canner had built up enough. They didn't talk much during those sessions. Estelle would demonstrate, Lorraine would copy, and the work got done. Sometimes Estelle's hands would correct something Lorraine was doing wrong, adjusting the way she held a paring knife, steadying a jar that wobbled, and those moments of physical contact were the closest thing to warmth Lorraine felt from her mother-in-law that first year. Colleen came in December. Lorraine went into labor on a Tuesday morning while Clayton was out checking fence line in the north pasture. By the time he got back to the house, she was already timing contractions at 7 minutes apart. They called the midwife a woman named Bertha Casper, who delivered half the babies in the county. No hospital. The nearest one was in Hayes, 45 minutes away, and by the time Lorraine's water broke, there wouldn't have been time anyway. Estelle showed up as Bertha was setting up in the bedroom. She didn't ask if Lorraine wanted her there. Just came in, washed her hands at the kitchen sink, rolled up her sleeves, and went upstairs. When the contractions got bad enough that Lorraine couldn't think straight anymore, when the pain wiped everything else away and left just the animal need to push, Estelle was the one holding her hand, pressing a cool cloth to her forehead, telling her when to breathe and when to bear down. Colleen came out squalling at 4 in the afternoon, 6 pounds, 3 ounces. Bertha cleaned her up and handed her to Lorraine, and Estelle stood there at the bedside with tears in her eyes. It was the first time Lorraine had seen her cry. The first time the distance between them cracked open enough to show something warm underneath. Clayton came in after Bertha had gone, and Estelle had helped Lorraine into a clean nightgown. He stood in the doorway looking at his daughter with an expression Lorraine couldn't read. Not joy, exactly. Something quieter. Something that looked almost like fear. He stayed for maybe 5 minutes. Touched Colleen's head with one finger so gentle it barely registered. Then he went back outside. Lorraine heard the truck start up, heard gravel scatter as he drove off. Estelle, folding towels at the foot of the bed, didn't look up. "He'll come around. Men don't know what to do with babies." But it wasn't about not knowing what to do. Lorraine understood that even then, exhausted and wrung out and trying to figure out how to get this tiny person to latch on and nurse. Clayton had gone back to work because work was what he knew. The farm came first. Always. And she'd just learned the first real lesson of being married to a farmer. You might be his wife. You might have just given him a daughter, but the land and the equipment and the endless cycle of planting and harvest, that was the marriage he'd committed to long before he met her. The months after Colleen's birth blurred together in a haze of sleepless nights and endless laundry and the particular exhaustion that comes from caring for an infant while trying to maintain a household. Clayton worked long days. Up before dawn, back after dark during planting season. Lorraine managed alone most of the time, learning to nurse while stirring a pot on the stove to change diapers one-handed while carrying a basket of wet clothes to the line. Money was tight but stable. Vernon ran a careful operation. 480 acres of dryland wheat equipment paid off no debt anywhere Lorraine could see. Clayton drew a salary of sorts from the farm profits, enough to cover groceries and utilities and the occasional doctor visit. They lived simply. Lorraine learned to make one chicken last 3 meals. Learned to darn socks instead of buying new ones. Learned that wanting things, new curtains, a radio for the kitchen, a decent winter coat was something you did quietly to yourself and didn't mention out loud. By the time the auction came around in August of '71, Lorraine had been a farm wife for 2 years. She'd learned the rhythms of it, learned when to speak and when to stay quiet, learned to read Clayton's moods by the set of his shoulders when he came in for dinner, learned that Vernon's silence wasn't personal, wasn't directed at her specifically, it was just how he moved through the world. But she hadn't learned yet what that auction meant. Hadn't understood the weight of what passed between father and son when Vernon looked at Clayton, and Clayton lowered his hand. The weeks after the auction, Clayton grew quieter. Not angry, not sullen, just absent in a way that made Lorraine feel like she was living with a ghost. He worked the same hours, came home at the same time, sat at the table, and ate whatever she put in front of him. But the part of him that used to talk to her about his day, that used to ask about Colleen's milestones, or comment on the weather, or make plans for Sunday afternoons, that part withdrew somewhere Lorraine couldn't reach. She tried asking what was wrong. Got one-word answers. Tried giving him space. That didn't help either. By September, they were barely speaking, except when necessary. "Pass the salt. Colleen needs new shoes. Think it'll rain tomorrow." Sunday dinners at Vernon and Estelle's house became exercises in endurance. The 4 adults would sit around the big dining table, the one that could seat 12 during harvest, when the crews came through, and eat pot roast or fried chicken, while the silence pressed down on them like humidity before a storm. Estelle would ask about Colleen. Lorraine would answer. Vernon would compliment the food. Estelle would thank him. Clayton would eat and say nothing. Nobody mentioned the combine. Nobody mentioned the auction, but it sat there between them like an uninvited guest, taking up space at the table. 1972 brought better wheat prices. The Soviet Union had started buying American grain by the trainload, and suddenly farmers who'd been scraping by for a decade were making actual money. Vernon and Clayton had a good year. Paid off some small debts Lorraine hadn't known existed. Bought a used New Holland square baler at a farm sale in Ellis County. Put $11,000 in the bank. Clayton mentioned buying new equipment one evening in November. They were in bed, the lights off, Colleen asleep in her crib in the corner. His voice came out of the darkness. "We should upgrade the combine." Lorraine felt her stomach tighten. "What did your father say?" "Haven't asked him yet." She waited. The house was so quiet she could hear mice scratching in the walls behind the headboard. "Going to talk to him tomorrow." The next evening, Clayton came home and didn't say a word about it. Lorraine didn't ask. 2 days later, over Sunday dinner, Vernon mentioned planning to keep the existing equipment another season. Clayton's jaw went tight, but he nodded. After that, the subject didn't come up again, not out loud. But Lorraine could feel it there, unresolved, growing like mold in a dark corner. In March of '73, Lorraine missed her period. She waited 2 weeks before saying anything, hoping it was just stress or exhaustion catching up with her. When she missed the second one, she drove to Dr. Morrison's office in Hayes and sat in the waiting room with her hands folded in her lap, trying not to cry. The test came back positive. Dr. Morrison smiled and congratulated her. Lorraine thanked him and drove home and sat in the truck in the driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. She hadn't planned this. She and Clayton had talked vaguely about maybe having another child eventually. But not now. Not when money was still uncertain and Colleen was barely 3, and their marriage felt like something made of glass that might shatter if anyone breathed too hard near it. She told him that night after Colleen was in bed. He was sitting at the kitchen table with the farm ledger open in front of him, pencil in hand, adding up columns of numbers. She stood in the doorway and said it plain. "I'm pregnant." He looked up, blinked, set the pencil down. "When?" "December, probably. Maybe January." He stood, came around the table, pulled her into a hug. It was the first time he'd touched her with any kind of affection in months. She felt something in her chest crack open, relief and grief mixed together so thoroughly she couldn't separate them. "That's good," he said into her hair. "That's real good, Lorraine." But over his shoulder she could see the ledger on the table, could see the numbers written in his careful hand, could see the column marked savings and the one marked equipment fund, and she knew standing there in his arms that this baby was going to complicate things in ways neither of them wanted to think about yet. Marjorie came in December of '73. An easier birth than Colleen, faster, though Lorraine wouldn't have described it as easy. Estelle was there again. Bertha Casper, too. Clayton stayed in the house, this time downstairs, pacing between the kitchen and the living room, while Lorraine labored upstairs. She could hear his boots on the wooden floor, the rhythm of it almost comforting in its steadiness. The medical bill came to $140, more than they'd budgeted for. Clayton paid it without comment, but Lorraine saw the way his mouth tightened when he wrote the check. Money got tighter after Marge was born. Babies needed things. Diapers and formula when nursing didn't produce enough milk. Clothes that had to be bought new because Colleen's hand-me-downs were worn through. Medicine when Marge came down with croup in February and they had to drive to the emergency room at 2 in the morning. Lorraine started looking for work. Not teaching, there were no openings in Hayes, and she couldn't leave 2 babies to commute to Kansas City. But the county extension office needed part-time help. Filing, answering phones, occasionally typing up reports for the ag agents. $85 a month for 20 hours a week. She took it. Didn't ask Clayton first, just came home and told him she'd be starting the following Monday. He looked surprised, but didn't argue. Estelle agreed to watch the girls during Lorraine's shifts. Said it wasn't any trouble. Said she liked having babies in the house again. The money helped. Not enough to make them comfortable, but enough to stop the slow bleed of their savings account. Enough that Lorraine could buy groceries without adding up the total in her head 3 times before getting in the checkout line. But working meant less time at home, meant leaving her daughters with Estelle 4 mornings a week, meant coming back to find Colleen clingy and crying because she didn't understand why Mama kept disappearing. Meant falling into bed at night too exhausted to talk to Clayton, too tired for anything except sleep. In the spring of '74, wheat prices climbed even higher. $4.56 a bushel by December. Vernon and Clayton had another good year. Better than good. The best year Lorraine had seen since moving to the farm. Clayton started talking about expansion. Not to Vernon, to Lorraine late at night when they couldn't sleep. If they increased acreage by 30%, he said they could double their income in 3 years. Maybe buy some of the Johnson land north of their property when old man Johnson finally retired. Build something bigger, something that would last. Lorraine listened and didn't say what she was thinking. That expansion meant debt, and debt meant pressure, and pressure meant more nights like the ones they were already having, where they lay in bed separately together saying nothing. In August of '74, Clayton brought up the combine again. Over dinner with Vernon and Estelle present. Said they needed to modernize. Said the old pull type they were running was costing them time and money. Said every neighbor within 10 miles had upgraded to self-propelled equipment, and they were falling behind. Vernon set down his fork, looked at his son across the table, spoke in that quiet, immovable way he had. Equipment we have works fine. Clayton's face went red. It's 20 years old. Runs every year. It takes us twice as long to harvest as anyone else. But we finish. We could do more acres if we don't have more acres. The conversation ended there. Estelle started clearing plates, even though nobody had finished eating. Lorraine picked up Marge, who'd started fussing in her high chair. Clayton excused himself and went outside. Vernon stayed at the table, hands folded in front of him, staring at nothing. Driving home that night, Lorraine tried to talk to him. Maybe he has a point. About the equipment. Clayton's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He won't even consider it. He's been farming a long time. Maybe he knows. Don't. Please don't take his side. The anger in his voice made her stop. She looked out the window at the dark fields passing by and said nothing else. By the end of '74, Lorraine had been married 5 years. She was 33 years old. She had 2 daughters, a part-time job, and a marriage that felt like it was held together with wire and prayer. She'd given up teaching, given up the city, given up the version of herself that had imagined building a career, traveling, maybe writing a book someday. She didn't regret those sacrifices exactly, but she felt them, felt the weight of them accumulating like sediment at the bottom of a river. And she was starting to understand something she hadn't seen clearly before. Vernon wasn't standing in Clayton's way out of stubbornness or spite. He was trying to protect something, trying to guard against a danger he could see and Clayton couldn't. And Lorraine, caught between them, didn't know whose side she was supposed to be on. March of '75 brought change, not the kind anyone planned for, the kind that arrived sudden and final and left no room for argument. Clayton came home on a Tuesday afternoon and found Lorraine in the kitchen peeling potatoes for dinner. Marge was napping upstairs. Colleen was drawing at the table with crayons, keeping herself occupied the way she'd learned to do. He stood in the doorway longer than usual. Lorraine glanced up and saw something in his face that made her put down the peeler. "I went to Hayes today," he said. She waited. "Stopped by Garrett Henderson's lot. He's got a used TR-75 sitting there. 73 model. Low hours." Her stomach dropped. "What did your father say?" "Haven't told him yet." "Clayton, it's $22,000. Garrett can get me financed at 9% over 5 years. She set the potato down, wiped her hands on her apron, felt her pulse in her throat. "You can't buy equipment without talking to Vernon first. It's not his decision. He's your partner. You work the land together. And I'm 32 years old, Lorraine. I have a family. I need to build something." She wanted to argue, wanted to point out that they had something already, a home, steady work, no debt hanging over them. Wanted to ask what would happen if prices dropped, or the equipment failed, or any of the 1,000 things that could go wrong on a farm went wrong. But she looked at his face and saw the same expression he'd worn at that auction 4 years ago. The certainty, the conviction that this was the moment everything would change, and she knew nothing she said would matter. 2 weeks later, he came home and told her he'd put down a deposit. $2,000. The combine would be delivered in 10 days. She stood at the kitchen sink with her back to him, hands gripping the edge of the counter. "You didn't talk to me. I'm talking to you now. That's not the same thing. Lorraine, we have 2 children, Clayton. We're barely keeping up as it is. And you just committed us to what, $450 a month?" $456. The precision of the number made it worse somehow, made it real in a way that vague worry couldn't touch. She turned around. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen looking at her with something that might have been defiance or might have been fear. She couldn't tell which. "What if something goes wrong?" His jaw set. "Nothing's going to go wrong." That night, after the girls were in bed, Clayton went to tell Vernon. Lorraine stood in the hallway outside the kitchen listening. She shouldn't have. She knew it was wrong to eavesdrop, but she couldn't help herself, couldn't walk away from the sound of her husband's voice saying the words that were going to change everything. Vernon was in his living room reading the Hayes Daily News. Clayton stood in the doorway. Lorraine could picture it, even though she couldn't see it. Vernon in his chair by the lamp paper folded in his lap. Clayton standing with his hands at his sides, waiting for his father to look up. "I bought a combine." A long silence. Then the sound of newspaper pages being folded. "With what money?" "A loan." "How much?" $20,000. 5-year note. Vernon's voice when it came was so quiet Lorraine had to strain to hear it. "You just put a chain around this farm. It's a good machine. We'll pay it off in 3 years. If we have 3 good years. We've had 5 good years. And before that we had 10 bad ones. Things are different now." "No, they're not." Lorraine heard movement, footsteps, water running in the kitchen sink. When Vernon spoke again, his voice was closer, louder. "You know what debt does. It doesn't care about good intentions. Doesn't care how hard you work. First bad year, you'll be scrambling. Second bad year, you'll be behind. Third bad year, they'll take everything. That's not going to happen. You don't know that. Nobody knows that. That's why you don't borrow what you can't pay back when things go wrong." Clayton's voice rose for the first time. "I'm trying to build something here. For my family, for my daughters. I can't do that with equipment from the 50s. Your daughters need a father who can sleep at night. Not one who's working himself to death trying to service debt." Lorraine heard Clayton's boots on the wooden floor, heard the screen door slam. She waited, heart pounding, until she was sure Vernon wasn't coming out. Then she went upstairs. Clayton was already in bed, staring at the ceiling. She undressed quietly, slid under the covers, reached for his hand. His fingers were cold rigid. "He'll come around," she whispered. "No, he won't." They lay there in the dark, not touching, except where their hands met. Outside, a barn owl called from somewhere near the equipment shed. The wind picked up, rattling the window in its frame. Later that night, when Clayton had finally fallen asleep, Lorraine heard soft footsteps in the hallway. A gentle knock on the bedroom door. She got up, careful not to wake him, and opened it to find Estelle standing there in her nightgown. They went downstairs. Estelle put water on for tea. They sat at the kitchen table while the kettle heated, saying nothing. When the water boiled, Estelle poured 2 cups, set one in front of Lorraine. "He's proud," Estelle said quietly. "Both of them." Lorraine wrapped her hands around the cup, feeling the heat seep into her palms. Vernon won't bend. Clayton can't back down. What do I do? Estelle looked at her. In the dim light from the stove, her face was all shadows and lines, years of hard living written there in ways Lorraine was only beginning to understand. What every farm wife does. You hold it together when they can't. The combine arrived on a Thursday in early May. Lorraine watched from the kitchen window as the flatbed trailer rolled down the driveway. Garrett Henderson drove it off the trailer himself, a big man in coveralls and a cap with the New Holland logo stitched across the front. The machine was massive, blue and yellow, so much larger than the old pull-type sitting in the shed that it made everything else on the farm look small by comparison. Clayton was waiting by the machine shed. Vernon was nowhere to be seen. Lorraine looked up toward the big farmhouse and saw him standing on the porch, hands in his pockets, watching. Clayton spent the next 2 weeks going over every inch of that combine, checking belts, greasing fittings, adjusting the concaves that separated grain from chaff. Lorraine would find him out there in the evenings after dinner, sometimes working until dark, sometimes just standing next to the machine with his hand on the metal, like he was trying to convince himself it was real. She wanted him to be happy about it, wanted to see him proud of this thing he'd fought so hard to get. But when he came to bed those nights, he didn't look proud. He looked worried, and that worried her more than anything. June came. They planted wheat. July brought custom baling work that Clayton took on to bring in extra money. August meant harvest. The TR-75 performed exactly as the dealer had promised. Cut through 480 acres in 11 days, the fastest harvest they'd ever had. Vernon never said a word about it. Didn't compliment the machine's performance. Didn't acknowledge that Clayton had been right about the efficiency gains. Just worked alongside his son the way he always had, quiet and steady, and when it was done, went back to his own house without comment. September 15th. The first payment came due. $456 to be paid on the 15th of every month for the next 60 months. Clayton wrote the check at the kitchen table while Lorraine watched. His handwriting was careful, precise. He tore the check from the book, folded it into an envelope, sealed it. "That's it," he said. "First one down, 59 to go." He smiled when he said it, trying to sound confident. But Lorraine saw the way his hand shook slightly as he set the envelope on the counter. She'd started keeping a separate bank account that spring. Didn't tell Clayton about it. Opened it on a Tuesday when she was in Hayes for her shift at the extension office, walked into First National and asked about opening a savings account in her name only. The teller, a woman named Dorothy, who Lorraine knew from church, didn't ask questions. Just processed the paperwork and took Lorraine's initial deposit of $35. It wasn't much. Lorraine added to it when she could, $10 here, 20 there, skimmed from her paychecks before Clayton saw them. She told herself it was for emergencies, a safety net. But really, it was insurance against the fear that had started growing in her chest the moment Clayton signed those loan papers. The fear that if everything fell apart, she'd need to be able to take care of her daughters on her own. October brought the first hint of trouble. Wheat prices dropped. Not a collapse, just a correction. Down from $4.10 a bushel to $3.50. Still a decent price. Still profitable. But lower than the previous year and moving in the wrong direction. Clayton noticed. Started coming home later, staying in the fields longer. Started double-checking the ledgers at night, going over the numbers again and again, like maybe he'd find something he'd missed the first 3 times. Lorraine watched him and said nothing. Kept working her shifts at the extension office. Kept adding small amounts to her secret account. Kept the house running and the girls fed, and the marriage from cracking whiter than it already had. By December, she was pregnant again. She found out 2 days before Christmas. Sat in Dr. Morrison's office and tried not to cry when he gave her the news. Another baby. Another mouth to feed. Another set of expenses they hadn't planned for. She didn't tell Clayton right away. Couldn't bring herself to add to the weight he was already carrying. Waited until after the holidays, until the new year had started, and maybe things felt a little less precarious. When she finally told him in the middle of January, with snow falling outside and Marge asleep on the couch, he pulled her close and said it was good news. Great news. But his voice was hollow, and when he held her, she felt him trembling. Willa came early. 3 weeks before her due date on a cold Tuesday morning in December of 1976, when the wind rattled the windows and frost covered the inside of the glass in patterns that looked like ferns. Lorraine woke at 4 to contractions that felt different from the other 2 births, sharper, faster, closer together from the start. She shook Clayton awake, and he drove her to the hospital in Hayes, 45 minutes through darkness and blowing snow, both hands gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles went white. They made it with 20 minutes to spare. Willa came out screaming at 6:37 in the morning, 5 pounds 8 ounces smaller than her sisters, but loud enough to fill the delivery room. The doctor said everything looked fine, said to keep her warm, feed her, often watch for jaundice. Lorraine nodded through the fog of exhaustion and relief and the particular terror that comes with holding something so small and breakable. The hospital bill arrived 2 weeks later, $340, higher than they'd budgeted, higher than either of the previous births because this one had happened in a hospital instead of at home with a midwife. Lorraine opened the envelope standing at the kitchen counter, read the number twice to make sure she'd seen it. Right then, folded the paper and tucked it into the drawer where she kept recipes she never used. She didn't tell Clayton about it immediately. Waited 3 days until she found the right moment until he seemed calm enough to hear it without his face going that particular shade of tight. When she finally showed him, he stared at the bill for a long time without speaking. Then he got the checkbook from the desk in the living room and wrote out the payment in his careful hand. The January combine payment came due 2 weeks after that, $456. Clayton sat at the kitchen table with the checkbook open in front of him and the stack of bills Lorraine had organized by due date. He looked at the numbers, looked at the bank balance, looked back at the bills. Lorraine was nursing Willa in the rocking chair by the window, Colleen and Marge playing with wooden blocks on the floor nearby. She watched her husband's shoulders tighten, watched his jaw set, watched him close the checkbook without writing anything. "I'll make it up next month," his voice low enough that the girls wouldn't hear the worry in it. "Prices are good. We'll catch up." The next month brought another bill they hadn't expected. The furnace needed a new blower motor, and without it the house stayed cold enough that Lorraine could see her breath in the mornings. And the month after that, Marge got an ear infection that required antibiotics and a follow-up visit. And the month after that, the truck needed new tires because the old ones had worn through to the cords and driving on them was asking to slide off the road in wet weather. By March, they were 3 payments behind on the combine. Lorraine's secret savings account, which had grown to $230 by the time Willa was born, was down to $30. She'd used $200 to cover a gap in February when the bank sent a letter saying the loan was in arrears. Deposited it into their joint account without telling Clayton where it came from, let him think they'd scraped it together from somewhere he'd forgotten about. She felt like a thief, felt like she was betraying herself, taking money she'd saved as insurance against catastrophe and feeding it into the machine that was becoming the catastrophe. But what else could she do? Let the bank take the combine. Let Clayton's humiliation be complete. She'd made vows, for better or worse. This was worse. 1977 brought the kind of spring farmers talk about for years afterward, always in tones of bitter resignation. A late freeze in April when the wheat was already up and growing tender green shoots reaching toward warmth that vanished overnight. Lorraine woke to the sound of Clayton swearing in the yard, went to the window and saw him standing in the field behind the house, hands on his hips, staring at wheat that had been vibrant the day before and was now blackened at the tips, like someone had taken a torch to it. The damage was patchy, but extensive. Some sections came through untouched. Others died completely. Vernon walked the fields with Clayton that afternoon, the two of them moving through the rows in silence. When they came back to the house for dinner, Vernon's face was carved from stone. 30%, he said to Estelle when she asked. Maybe more. The harvest that year was the poorest Lorraine had seen. What wheat survived the freeze didn't yield well, and prices stayed flat at $3.40 when they'd been hoping for a climb to $4. The income from the crop barely covered operating costs. Nothing left over for savings. Nothing left over for catching up on delayed payments. Lorraine had to dip into her account again in August. This time she withdrew the last $30 to buy school supplies for Colleen, who was starting first grade and needed notebooks and pencils and a lunchbox. She could have asked Clayton for the money. Should have. But he was already carrying so much weight that adding one more expense felt cruel. By September, her secret account was empty, and the combine payment was still due on the 15th of every month, $456, like clockwork, like a heartbeat they couldn't escape. The fight happened on a Tuesday evening in late September. The girls were in bed. Lorraine was washing dishes at the sink. Clayton sat at the table going through the ledger for what must have been the 5th time that week. She could hear the scratch of his pencil, the occasional sigh when the numbers refused to add up differently. Her hands stilled in the dishwater. She turned around, drying her hands on a towel that had started to fray at the edges. "Clayton, we can't keep doing this." He didn't look up. "One more year. Prices will come back. You said that last year, and I believe it this year too. What if you're wrong?" Now he looked at her. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, dark circles underneath making him look older than 34. "I'm not wrong. How do you know? How can you possibly know what wheat prices will do 12 months from now? Because they always come back eventually. Markets cycle. This is a down year. Next year will be better." "And if it's not," his jaw tightened. "It will be." Lorraine felt something crack inside her chest, felt years of holding her tongue, of swallowing worry, of pretending everything would work out if they just believed, hard enough felt all of it rise up like water behind a dam that couldn't hold any more. "From where I'm standing, we're drowning. Do you understand that? We're drowning and you keep telling me to swim harder."
Clayton stood up. The chair scraped against the floor loud enough that Lorraine worried it would wake the girls. Then maybe you shouldn't be standing there.
Maybe you should trust me. I do trust you. I trust you so much that I've given up everything, my career, my savings, any sense of security to be here with you. But trust isn't magic, Clayton. It doesn't pay bills. He turned away from her hands, gripping the edge of the counter. His back was rigid, shoulders up around his ears. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible.
I know what I'm doing. Do you? Because it doesn't feel like it from where I am.
She left the room before he could respond. Went upstairs and checked on the girls, all three asleep. Willa in her crib, Colleen and Marge, sharing the double bed with a blanket pulled up to their chins. Then she went into the bathroom and closed the door and sat on the edge of the tub and cried as quietly as she could manage, one hand over her mouth to muffle the sound. 3 months later, on a Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks before Christmas, Lorraine drove to Vernon and Estelle's house to drop off a pie she'd baked for the church potluck. The big farmhouse was quiet when she pulled up, no smoke coming from the chimney despite the cold. She knocked on the front door. No answer. Knocked again, louder. Nothing. She tried the door. Unlocked. Stepped inside, calling Vernon's name, then Estelle's. The house smelled like coffee and old wood and something else underneath a staleness that made Lorraine's stomach clench. She found him in the barn, lying on his side in the center aisle between the empty stalls, one hand pressed to his chest, face gray as winter sky. His eyes were open but unfocused, breathing shallow and rapid like a dog left in the heat too long. Lorraine ran back to the house, called the ambulance, then called Clayton at their place. Her voice came out steadier than she felt.
Vernon's had a heart attack. Ambulance is coming. Meet us at the hospital.
She went back to the barn and knelt beside her father-in-law. Took his hand. It was cold, the skin papery thin over bones that felt too prominent. She told him help was coming. Told him to hold on. Told him she was right here and he wasn't alone. Vernon's eyes found hers. Focused for just a moment. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Then the ambulance arrived, red lights flashing across the barn walls, and the paramedics were there with their equipment and their calm, professional voices, telling Lorraine to step back, give them room to work. She rode to the hospital in her own truck, following the ambulance through town and out to the regional medical center in Hayes. Clayton was already there when they wheeled Vernon in on a gurney, standing in the waiting room with his hands shoved in his pockets and his face absolutely white. Lorraine went to him, put her arms around him, felt him shaking. Is he? They're working on him. The paramedics said it's a heart attack, but he was conscious when I found him. Clayton nodded against her shoulder. Then his breath hitched and she realized he was crying. Actually crying something she'd only seen him do once before at their wedding, when the pastor pronounced them husband and wife. She held him tighter, felt the tremors running through him. Understood in that moment something she'd been too angry to see before. Clayton wasn't afraid of failure, wasn't afraid of being wrong. He was afraid of becoming his father, cautious, careful, content with small and safe. And he was terrified of losing him before he could prove that his way worked too, that you could take risks and survive them, that the next generation could build something bigger without destroying what came before. Vernon survived. The doctor said it was mild as heart attacks go, but the warning was clear. His heart was weak. He needed to slow down, cut back on physical labor, consider retirement. Vernon said he'd think about it. But when spring came, he was back in the field, same as always. Moving slower, maybe, taking breaks he wouldn't have taken before. But there, still working. Still Vernon. 1978 brought repairs the combine seemed determined to need. In May, a bearing seized in the feeder house right in the middle of a parts replacement. Clayton was doing himself to save money. The bearing alone cost $290. Labor to install it properly, because Clayton couldn't manage it alone and had to call Garrett Henderson for help, ran another $180. Total $470. Lorraine used the credit card for groceries that month, the first time she'd done it. Promised herself it was temporary, just until they caught up. But the balance crept up $60 in June, $90 in July, $120 by August, when the air conditioner broke and they had to choose between sweltering through a Kansas summer with 3 small children or putting the repair on credit. In late August during harvest, the hydraulic pump on the combine failed. Oil everywhere, the machine dead in the middle of a field with half the crop still standing. Clayton called Garrett, who drove out with a replacement pump and the tools to install it. $650 for parts and labor. Clayton didn't have it. Lorraine watched him make the call, heard him ask if Garrett could roll the repair cost into the loan. Heard the long pause, then Garrett's voice tinny through the phone receiver saying he'd see what he could do. 2 days later, Garrett called back. The bank agreed, but it would extend the loan term by 6 months. Turn a 5-year note into a 5.5-year note. Add that much more interest, that much more time under the weight of the payment. Clayton signed the papers without telling Lorraine. She found out a week later when she was looking for the insurance documents and came across the new loan agreement in the filing cabinet. Saw the adjusted terms, saw the new payoff date, sat there on the floor with the papers in her lap,
feeling something in her chest go numb. That night, after the girls were asleep, she told him she was going to help Estelle with a quilting project. Said it might take a few nights a week for the next month or so. Clayton nodded, distracted, already focused on something else. The truck stop diner on Highway 40 was hiring. Lorraine had seen the sign 2 weeks earlier driving back from Hayes. Now she pulled into the parking lot at 9:30 on a Thursday night, walked in through the glass door with its neon open sign buzzing in the window, and asked if the position was still available. The manager, a heavy-set man named Dale with grease stains on his shirt, looked her up and down. "You ever wait tables?" "No, but I learn fast. Hours are 10 to 2. 3 nights a week to start, maybe more if you work out. $2.50 an hour plus whatever tips you make. Mostly truckers this time of night, so don't expect much." Lorraine took it. Started the following Tuesday. Learned to balance 4 plates on her arms to pour coffee while taking an order to smile at men who looked at her too long and tip anyway because rent didn't pay itself on righteousness. She made maybe $15 in tips her first shift, 22 the second. By her 4th week, she'd figured out which truckers were regulars, which ones liked their eggs over easy versus scrambled, who wanted conversation, and who wanted to be left alone with their food and their thoughts. The tips improved. $30 a night, sometimes 40 if she worked Friday. The money went into an envelope in the back of her underwear drawer. Cash only. No bank account this time. Too risky. If Clayton found out she was working, he'd ask questions. Want to know why she hadn't told him. Want to know what she was doing with the money. And Lorraine couldn't explain, couldn't put into words that she needed this. Needed to know she could provide for her daughters if everything fell apart. Needed to feel like she had some control, however small, in a life that felt increasingly like standing on ice that was cracking under her feet. The cost was higher than money. Lorraine taught Colleen, 9 years old, how to dial 911 in an emergency. Taught her how to warm a bottle for Willa if the baby woke up crying. Taught her that if anything happened, anything at all, she should run to Grandma Estelle's house. Then 3 nights a week, Lorraine tucked her daughters into bed, waited until they were asleep, and drove to the diner. Left them alone in that farmhouse with its creaking floors and drafty windows, and the knowledge that if something went wrong, she was 20 minutes away. She hated herself for it, hated that this was what their lives had become. But she hated the alternative more, the helplessness, the watching their savings evaporate, the slow drowning Clayton refused to acknowledge. Estelle found out in October. Showed up at the farmhouse at 2:30 in the morning on a Wednesday, let herself in with the spare key Vernon had given her years ago, and was sitting at the kitchen table when Lorraine came home. Lorraine's heart nearly stopped. She stood in the doorway, still wearing her waitress apron, smelling like fryer grease and coffee, staring at her mother-in-law. Estelle's voice was quiet, controlled. "How long?" 2 months. "The girls, Colleen watches them. I taught her what to do." "She's 9 years old, Lorraine." "I know." Her voice broke on the words. "I know, and I hate it, but I don't know what else to do. We're so far behind, and if I can't..." Estelle stood up, crossed the kitchen, put her arms around Lorraine and held her while she fell apart. Let her cry into her shoulder, let her shake with exhaustion and shame, and the particular despair of someone who's doing everything they can and watching it not be enough. When Lorraine could breathe again, Estelle stepped back, kept her hands on Lorraine's shoulders. "You can't keep doing this." "I have to." "No, you don't. Starting tomorrow, bring the girls to me before your shift. I'll watch them. They can sleep in the guest room. You pick them up when you're done." "Estelle, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm telling." Her grip tightened. "You're not alone in this, Lorraine. You hear me? You're not alone." Lorraine nodded, unable to speak. That night, for the first time and longer than she could remember, she felt something loosen in her chest. Not relief exactly, but something close. The knowledge that at least one person saw what she was carrying, saw it and stepped in to help shoulder the weight. 1979 brought the economic collapse nobody saw coming. The grain embargo hit in January. President Carter suspended grain exports to the Soviet Union in response to their invasion of Afghanistan, and overnight, the market that had been propping up wheat prices evaporated. Prices dropped from $3.60 to $2.80 a bushel in a matter of weeks. Farmers who'd been making money for the first time in years found themselves underwater. Equipment dealers started seeing repossessions. Banks started getting nervous. And Clayton, sitting at that kitchen table with the ledger open watching the numbers spiral into red ink, stopped being able to hide the fear. By September, he owed $15,200 on a machine he'd bought for $22,000 4 years earlier, had paid nearly $15,000 in payments and repairs and interest. And the principal had barely moved, had actually grown because of the loan extension, because of the repair cost rolled in, because compound interest doesn't care about effort or good intentions. Lorraine was working 6 nights a week at the diner by then. Extension office during the day. Diner at night, sleeping maybe 4 hours in between. Her tips envelope had $800 in it, more money than she'd ever had at one time. It should have felt like security. Instead, it felt like evidence of how bad things had gotten. In early November, Colleen's teacher called. Mrs. Patterson, a woman Lorraine had met at parent conferences but didn't really know. Her voice on the phone line was careful, professional, concerned. "Mrs. Mitchell, I wanted to talk to you about Colleen. She's been falling asleep in class multiple times this week. Is everything all right at home?" Everything was not all right at home. Colleen was staying up late worrying. Lorraine could see it in her daughter's eyes, the shadows under them, the way she watched her parents at dinner with a wariness no 9-year-old should have to learn. Marge was acting out, hitting other children at school, throwing tantrums over nothing. And Willa, at 3 years old, barely spoke. Just watched everything with big, dark eyes and stayed quiet, like she'd figured out that making noise meant adding to the chaos. Lorraine's children were suffering, not from lack of food or shelter or clothing, from something harder to name. The stress that permeated the house like a smell you couldn't air out. The tension between their parents that never quite broke into open fighting but never resolved either. The sense that something was wrong had been wrong for a long time and nobody was fixing it. "I'll talk to her," Lorraine told Mrs. Patterson. Hung up the phone, sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall, trying to figure out when exactly she'd lost control of her own life. The year turned worse. 1980 brought weather that seemed designed to inflict maximum damage. Hail in June that shredded the wheat when it was nearly ready to harvest. Drought through July that stunted what the hail hadn't destroyed. An early freeze in September that finished off whatever remained. The harvest was a disaster. Less than half of what they'd planted. Less than half of what they needed to break even. Clayton sold the grain auger to make a payment. Sold the square baler Vernon had bought in '72. Still not enough. Garrett Henderson came to the house on a Tuesday in early November. Didn't call ahead. Just drove up the driveway in his truck and knocked on the door. Lorraine answered. Saw his face and knew before he said anything that this was it. This was the moment everything finally broke. She invited him in, offered coffee. He declined. They stood in the living room awkward until Lorraine gestured to the couch and they both sat. Garrett cleared his throat. "Is Clayton here?" "Out in the south field. Should be back soon." "I can wait." But Lorraine needed to know. Needed to hear it so she could prepare herself, prepare some response that wouldn't be screaming or crying or both. "Just tell me, how bad is it really?" Garrett looked at his hands. Big hands scarred from years of working on equipment, turning wrenches, fixing things that broke. "Bank's calling the loan." The words landed like stones in still water, sank to the bottom of Lorraine's stomach and stayed there heavy and cold. "When?" "They want a decision by the end of the month. Trade in the combine for something smaller, something used, something paid for. They'll wipe the debt and start you over. And if we don't, then they repossess, take the combine, and probably start looking at other assets to recoup their losses." Other assets. The equipment. The land itself. Everything Vernon had built over 40 years. Everything he'd protected by never borrowing a dime he couldn't pay back in 2 bad years. Lorraine heard herself say something about talking to Clayton. Heard Garrett tell her to call him within a week. Heard the door close behind him. Then she was alone in the living room with afternoon light slanting through the windows and her daughters playing upstairs and her entire world coming apart at the seams. Clayton came home an hour later. Lorraine met him at the door. Told him about Garrett's visit before he even got his boots off. They sat at the kitchen table. The same table where they'd eaten thousands of meals, where Lorraine had nursed all 3 babies, where Clayton had written that first check for the combine 5 years ago, thinking it was the start of something better. "We have to sell it." Lorraine's voice came out flat, drained of everything except the simple truth she'd been avoiding for months. "No." "Look at our girls, Clayton. Colleen is 11 years old and she's raising her sisters because we're never here. Marge is angry all this time. Willa barely speaks. We're losing them. Don't you see? We're losing our family to save a machine." His face crumpled. The facade he'd been maintaining, the confidence, the certainty that one more year would fix everything, it all fell away, and underneath was just a man who'd bet everything on being right and lost. "I can't let him be right." Barely a whisper. "Who?" "My father. I can't let him be right about me." And suddenly Lorraine understood. All of it. The stubbornness. The refusal to quit, the doubling down year after year, even as the evidence mounted that this wasn't working. It wasn't about the combine at all. It was about a son trying to prove to his father that he could do things differently and succeed. That caution wasn't the only path forward. That taking risks could pay off. Except it hadn't paid off. And now they were here sitting at this table, and Lorraine had a choice. She could let Clayton keep fighting, keep trying to prove something to a man who'd had a heart attack 3 years ago and might not even be here to see how it ended. Or she could step in, make the decision he couldn't make for himself. "We're taking the deal." Clayton started to protest. She cut him off, something she'd never done in 11 years of marriage. "No."
Listen to me. Your father was right. Not because debt is always wrong. Not because playing it safe is the only way. He was right because we couldn't handle this one.
And that's okay. We're taking the deal and we're letting this go and we're going to rebuild from where we are. Not from where we wish we were. From where we actually are. He cried. Really cried the way men cry when something breaks that they didn't know could break. Lorraine held him. Let him shake in her arms. Let him grieve for the dream he'd been chasing and the man he thought he needed to be. The next day, Clayton called Garrett and accepted the trade. In December of 1980, they gave back the TR-75 and got a used pull-type combine in return. Same model they'd been running before Clayton bought the self-propelled. A 1968 with high hours and dubious maintenance history, but it was paid for. The bank forgave the remaining debt, wiped it clean, started them over. Clayton signed the papers and didn't look at the combine again. Lorraine stood next to him and felt something she hadn't expected, not shame or defeat, but relief so profound it made her knees weak. The payment was gone. $456 a month gone. That hole in their budget, that constant pressure, that source of fights and fear and sleepless nights, just gone. They went back to pull-type harvesting in 1981. Slower. Required hooking the machine up to the tractor, which meant they couldn't run 2 operations at once. Felt like going backward in every measurable way except one they could breathe again. Lorraine quit the diner job. The envelope in her underwear drawer had $940 in it. She took the money and paid off the credit card. Bought new shoes for all 3 girls. Put the rest in a real savings account, one she told Clayton about this time, and started over. Without the payment hanging over them, Clayton came home earlier. Started playing with the girls after dinner instead of disappearing into the fields or the shed or the ledger. Colleen started smiling again, sleeping through the night. Marge stopped hitting other kids at school. Willa started talking full sentences, questions about everything, making up for lost time. They were poor. Lorraine wouldn't pretend otherwise. They wore secondhand clothes and ate beans more nights than not and hadn't taken a vacation since their honeymoon. But they were together, and together felt like enough in ways it hadn't before. One afternoon in late summer of '82, Lorraine was canning peaches with Estelle in the big farmhouse kitchen. The work was hot, sticky, repetitive, blanching, fruit peeling, skins, filling jars, processing in the pressure canner. They'd been at it for 3 hours and had maybe 2 more to go. Estelle was working across from her hands, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. Steam rose from the pot between them. The kitchen windows were fogged over. Lorraine wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How did you do it all those years? How did you stay calm when things got hard?" Estelle's hands paused. She set down the peach she'd been peeling, looked at Lorraine across the steam. "Vernon and I made a promise when we married. We'd never let anything come between us and our peace. Not money, not pride, not other people's opinions. We decided early on what mattered, and we protected it. The farm. No." Estelle shook her head. "The farm was never the point, Lorraine. The point was always each other. The farm was just what we did. But we did it together. And when it got hard, and it did get hard more times than you know, we came back to that promise. We chose peace over proving something." Lorraine felt her throat tighten, felt tears start to burn behind her eyes. She tried to blink them back, but they came anyway, spilling over, running down her cheeks into the steam rising from the pot. Estelle came around the table, put her arms around Lorraine and held her while she cried into the peaches. Held her while years of holding everything together finally caught up. Held her until she could breathe again. The next few years moved slowly, deliberately. Wheat prices started to recover, not a boom, just a gradual climb back to $3.43.60 a bushel. Clayton and Vernon had average years, not spectacular, not disastrous, just steady. They paid off the small debts that had accumulated, fixed the roof on the barn, replaced the water heater when it finally gave out after 30 years, saved $3,000 by the end of '84. The marriage healed too, not all at once, not in any dramatic way, but in small moments that accumulated over time. Clayton reaching for Lorraine's hand at church, Lorraine laughing at something Clayton said over dinner. Sunday afternoons spent together doing nothing in particular, just being in the same room without tension crackling between them. They didn't talk much about the combine years, didn't need to. The memory of it lived in both of them, a reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything that actually mattered in pursuit of something that didn't. March of 1985 brought rain that turned the roads to mud and kept everyone inside for 3 days straight. On the 3rd day, a Thursday, Ruth called at 6 in the morning. Lorraine answered the phone, still half asleep. Heard Ruth's voice, steady but thin, say 3 words. "He's gone, Lorraine." Vernon had died in his sleep. Peaceful. No pain. Ruth had woken at her usual time, reached over to touch his shoulder and found him cold. Lorraine drove to the big farmhouse. Clayton was already there, sitting on the porch steps with his head in his hands. She sat down next to him. Didn't say anything. Just put her hand on his back and felt him shaking.
"I never told him I understood," he finally said. "Never said I was sorry for fighting him all those years. Never thanked him for being right."
He knew.
"How do you know?" "Because he stopped trying to convince you. He just waited for you to see it yourself. That's what love looks like sometimes. Waiting." The funeral was on a Saturday. More than 200 people came, neighbors, other farmers, people from churchmen Vernon had worked with over the decades. The pastor talked about faithfulness and endurance, about a man who'd farmed the same land for 49 years without ever making a spectacle of himself. A quiet man, a steady man, a man who understood that the goal wasn't glory, but continuation. Colleen, Margie, and Willa sat in the front pew between Lorraine and Ruth, dressed in their best clothes, confused by death in the way children are. This was their first funeral, their first real confrontation with loss. Lorraine watched them trying to make sense of it and felt her own grief compound with theirs. After the funeral, while others gathered at the church fellowship hall for lunch, Lorraine helped Ruth sort through papers in Vernon's office, the small room off the kitchen where he'd kept farm records going back to 1936, ledgers and receipts and notebooks filled with numbers in his careful hand. Ruth pulled out a metal box from the bottom drawer of the desk. "He kept personal things in here. You should look through it with Clayton, see if there's anything he'd want." Lorraine took the box back to their farmhouse that evening. Clayton was sitting in the living room staring at nothing. She set the box on the coffee table and opened it. Inside were birth certificates, the deed to the land. Vernon's discharge papers from the war he'd been too old to fight in but had tried to volunteer for anyway. And at the bottom, a spiral notebook with farm records written on the cover in faded ink. She flipped it open, pages and pages of entries, dates and numbers and brief notes about weather and yields and equipment purchases. She turned pages until she found one dated August 1971. TR-70 auction, $16,800. Too much. Below that, in smaller writing, almost like Vernon had added it later, "Clayton doesn't see it yet, but someday he will." Lorraine stared at the words, read them again, felt something shift in her understanding of the man who'd written them. She showed the page to Clayton, watched him read it, watched his face as the meaning sank in. "He knew," Clayton said. "He knew I'd buy one eventually. Knew I'd learn the hard way." Lorraine nodded. "Your mother told me something once. Years ago when we were first struggling. She said Vernon took debt once, 1947, to buy more land. Nearly lost everything in 53 when prices collapsed. That's why he was so afraid of it. He'd already paid the tuition for that lesson." Clayton was quiet for a long time, just sat there holding the notebook, running his thumb over his father's handwriting. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "I wasted so many years being angry at him, fighting him, trying to prove he was wrong." "No." Lorraine took his hand. "You learned something he needed you to learn. Sometimes the only teacher is time, and you can't teach someone to be patient by giving them what they want immediately. You have to let them discover it on their own." Clayton closed the notebook, set it down carefully like it was something fragile. And maybe it was. Maybe all those pages of Vernon's careful record-keeping were more fragile than they looked, evidence of a life lived deliberately, of choices made and consequences accepted, of wisdom earned the hard way and passed down to a son who'd had to learn it the hard way himself, because that's the only way some lessons stick. After Vernon's death, Lorraine became the farm's official bookkeeper. Not in title, Clayton still ran operations with the hired hand who came during planting and harvest, but in practice. She took over the ledgers Vernon had maintained with such meticulous care, learned to track expenses and income with the same precision, began making decisions about when to sell grain and when to hold it for better prices. Clayton asked her opinion before buying anything now. A $50 part for the tractor, seed for next year's planting, whether they could afford to replace the truck that was burning oil and needed a new transmission. They sat at the kitchen table together going over numbers, and for the first time in their marriage, Lorraine felt like a partner instead of someone waiting to be told what came next. The shift changed things between them in ways she hadn't anticipated. When Clayton deferred to her judgment on financial matters, when he actually listened to her concerns instead of dismissing them, it rebuilt something that had been damaged during the combine years. Trust, maybe, or respect, or just the simple acknowledgement that they were in this together, that her intelligence and instincts mattered as much as his experience. Ruth moved into a smaller house in Hayes in the spring of 1987. The big farmhouse felt too empty without Vernon, she said, too many rooms echoing with absence. She bought a 2-bedroom bungalow 3 blocks from Main Street, walking distance to the grocery store and the library and the Methodist church where she'd been attending services for 40 years. Lorraine visited every Tuesday afternoon. They'd drink coffee at Ruth's new kitchen table, much smaller than the one in the farmhouse, easier to manage for one person, and talk about things they'd never discussed when Vernon was alive. Ruth's childhood in western Kansas during the Depression, the miscarriage she'd had between Vernon's deployment paperwork being rejected
and Clayton being born. The years of wondering if they'd made the right choice staying on the farm when so many others had left for factory work in the cities.
I used to envy them, Ruth admitted one afternoon while Lorraine helped her plant tomatoes in the small garden plot behind the house. The women who moved away, who had washing machines that ran on electricity instead of hand cranks, who could go to the store without planning a whole day around it. Lorraine tamped soil around a seedling. Do you still? No. Because they had to leave everything they knew to get those things, and I got to stay. Got to wake up every morning and see the same land, the same sky. Got to raise my son in the house where his father was born. That was worth more than convenience. The words settled into Lorraine like seeds in fertile ground. She was 46 years old and only beginning to understand that the sacrifices she'd made, the teaching career, the city life, the version of herself that might have existed if she'd chosen differently, those sacrifices had bought her something too. Roots. Continuity. The kind of knowledge you can only gain by staying in one place long enough to see seasons cycle through decades. Colleen graduated from the University of Kansas in 1991 with a degree in business administration. Marge finished at Kansas State that same year. Elementary education already had a teaching position lined up in Topeka. Willa was still in high school talking about nursing school, spending her weekends volunteering at the regional hospital in Hayes. None of them wanted to farm. Lorraine felt the loss of that more acutely than she'd expected. All those years of sacrifice, all that work to keep the land, and her daughters were choosing different paths. She mentioned it to Clayton one evening while they were washing dishes together. Doesn't it bother you that they're not interested in taking over? Clayton was quiet for a moment, hands still in the soapy water. Used to. But Ruth said something after Dad's funeral that made me think about it differently. What's that? She said the whole point of what Dad did, the careful budgeting, the avoiding debt, the slow, steady work, the point wasn't to trap the next generation here. It was to give them choices. And our girls have choices because we didn't lose the farm. They can leave because we stayed. Lorraine dried a plate, set it in the cupboard. Felt tears prick at her eyes for reasons she couldn't quite name. Pride, maybe? Or grief for the version of continuity she'd imagined? Or just the bittersweet recognition that success sometimes looked nothing like what you'd planned? Preston Whitmore came into their lives on a Friday evening in October of 1989. Colleen brought him home from college for the weekend. This tall man in pressed khakis and a polo shirt with a logo Lorraine didn't recognize. He drove a black BMW, parked it next to Clayton's rusted Ford pickup, like a visitor from another planet. Over dinner, pot roast and potatoes, the meal Lorraine had been making for Sunday dinner since she married into the Mitchell family. Preston talked about his work at an investment firm in Kansas City. Used words like portfolio optimization and risk-adjusted returns. Asked Clayton questions about crop yields and profit margins that made farming sound like a spreadsheet exercise instead of work done with your hands in dirt that got under your fingernails and stayed there. So you're still farming? Preston's tone was polite, curious, the way you'd ask someone why they still used a rotary phone. That must be quaint. Lorraine watched Clayton's shoulders tense, saw his jaw tighten the way it did when he was working to keep his temper in check. Colleen jumped in before her father could respond. Dad's farm has been in our family since 1923. 4 generations. Preston nodded, cut a piece of meat. Right, but I mean farming isn't exactly a growth industry anymore. Have you thought about selling? The land value in this area has appreciated significantly. You could probably liquidate for... We're not selling. Clayton's voice was flat. Final. Preston blinked, seemed to realize he'd stepped on something. Of course, I just meant from a purely financial perspective, holding on to depreciating assets when you could... Lorraine set down her fork. The sound of metal against ceramic was louder than it should have been in the sudden quiet. Preston, this land isn't just an asset we're holding for appreciation. It's who we are. It's why Colleen understands the value of hard work. It's why she got her degree without debt. Because we don't borrow what we can't pay back, and we don't treat our legacy like something to liquidate. Preston's face went red. He looked at Colleen, who was staring at her plate. The rest of dinner passed in uncomfortable small talk about weather and KU's football season. Preston left early the next morning, some excuse about meetings Monday that he needed to prepare for. Colleen stayed through Sunday. She and Lorraine sat on the porch after church watching Marge and Willa play with the barn cats in the yard. I'm sorry about last night. Colleen's voice was small. Preston doesn't understand. He grew up in Overland Park. His dad's a doctor. They've never had to think about money the way we do. You don't need to apologize for who you're dating. I know, but I wanted you to like him. Lorraine looked at her daughter, 20 years old, smart, beautiful, full of potential. Do you love him? I don't know. Maybe. He's ambitious, driven. He wants to build something. So did your father. But there's different kinds of building. Preston wants to accumulate. Your dad wanted to create. There's a difference. Colleen nodded slowly. I'll think about it. She broke up with Preston 3 weeks later. Told Lorraine over the phone that it wasn't working, that they wanted different things. Lorraine didn't say, I told you so. Just listened while her daughter cried and promised her that the right person would come along eventually. Someone who understood what mattered. 1993 brought the best financial year the farm had seen since the early 70s. A wet spring in the Midwest meant a lot of farmers couldn't get their crops in. Kansas had perfect weather. Wheat prices climbed to $4.20 a bushel. And Clayton and Lorraine harvested a full crop sold at the peak and put $18,000 in savings. Clayton brought up buying new equipment. Not a combine this time, a tractor to replace the one that was burning oil and developing transmission problems. Lorraine looked at the bank balance, looked at him, felt her stomach tighten with old familiar fear. Can we afford it without stress? Prices are good. We could finance. No. The word came out harder than she meant it to. I mean, if we can't pay cash, we wait. We've been down that road before. Clayton's face did something complicated. Surprise, maybe? Or recognition? He nodded slowly. You're right. We'll wait. Save up for another year, buy it outright. They didn't buy a new tractor that year, or the year after. The old one kept running, held together with replacement parts and Clayton's stubborn maintenance schedule. By 1995, when the transmission finally gave out completely, they had enough saved to buy a used model for cash. No loan. No payment plan. Just money exchanged for equipment clean and simple. Lorraine felt something settle in her chest when Clayton signed the bill of sale. This was what Vernon had been trying to teach them all along. That waiting wasn't the same as giving up. That patience wasn't cowardice. That there was profound freedom in only owning what you could truly afford. The mid-90s brought weddings. Colleen married a high school teacher named David in 1995. Marge married another teacher, Mark, in 97. Willa got engaged to a doctor she met during nursing school, set the wedding for 99. All three daughters starting families of their own, building lives that looked nothing like Lorraine's but carried forward something essential she and Clayton had given them. Financial caution. The ability to distinguish between wanting something and needing it. An understanding that debt wasn't neutral. It cost you sleep, stole your peace, put chains around your future self. None of the girls wanted to take over the farm. The truth of that became undeniable as the years passed. Colleen and David bought a house in Lawrence. Marge and Mark settled in Topeka. Willa and her fiancé were planning to move to Wichita, where the hospital had offered him a position in cardiology. Clayton sold 300 acres to a neighboring farmer in the spring of '98. Kept 180 for himself, enough to manage with hired help during busy seasons, small enough that he and Lorraine could handle it as they got older. The money from the sale went into a retirement fund, planning for a future where their bodies wouldn't hold up to the physical demands of farming, where maybe they'd move into town like Ruth had spent their last years in a small house with a small yard and no equipment to maintain. November of 1999 brought an unexpected phone call. Garrett Henderson's voice crackling through the telephone line asking if Clayton might want to come look at a combine he'd just taken on trade. TR-85, 1986 model, low hours for its age. Clean maintenance records. I'm not really in the market, Clayton told him. But there was something in his voice, not hunger exactly, but interest. Curiosity maybe about equipment that had gotten better in the years since they'd given up the TR-75. Lorraine was folding laundry at the kitchen table, listening to Clayton's end of the conversation. When he hung up, she waited. Garrett's got a used combine, wants me to look at it. Do you want to? Maybe, just to see, not to buy. She nodded. I'll come with you. They drove to Hayes on a Saturday afternoon. The TR-85 sat in Garrett's lot, gleaming blue and yellow in the weak November sun. Newer model than the one they'd lost. More hours on it, but still in good shape. Garrett quoted them a price $19,500. You could finance it at 7% over 6 years. Garrett started, but Clayton was already shaking his head. Only interested if we can pay cash. Garrett blinked. You can pay cash? Clayton looked at Lorraine. She knew what he was asking without him having to say it. Knew he was giving her the choice this time, instead of making it himself and dealing with consequences later. Knew that this moment, this asking, this deferring to her judgment was worth more than any piece of equipment. Can we afford it without stress? She asked the same question she'd asked 6 years earlier about the tractor. Yes. Then get it. And they bought the TR-85 with a check written from their savings account. No financing agreement to sign. No loan terms to negotiate. No payment schedule that would follow them for the next half-decade. Just money they'd saved, equipment they could truly afford, and the freedom that came from owing nothing to anyone. The combine was delivered in October. Clayton sat in the cab for a long time that first day, hands resting on the steering wheel, not starting the engine. Just sitting. Lorraine walked out to the shed, climbed up the steps into the cab beside him. You okay? He was quiet for a moment.
I'm thinking about all the years I spent wanting a machine like this. How when I finally got one, the TR-75, I wasn't happy because I was drowning in payments. And now I have one again. Bought it the right way. And I'm not happy because I won.
He turned to look at her. I'm just relieved. That's it. Just relieved that we can afford it. That it's ours.
That no bank has a claim on it.
Lorraine reached for his hand. His fingers were rough from decades of farm work, scarred in places from equipment repairs and barbed wire fences. The hands that had signed for the TR-75 24 years ago, thinking it would change everything. The hands that had signed for the TR-85 today, older and wiser, understanding that the machine mattered less than the peace that came from owning it outright. That's wisdom, she told him.
That's what your father tried to give you. The knowledge that relief is worth more than pride. The first decade of the new millennium brought what Lorraine would later think of as the golden years. Clayton was in his late 50s, she was approaching 60, and they'd finally figured out how to farm without killing themselves or each other. They worked the 180 acres they'd kept, sold grain when prices were good, saved money slowly and deliberately.
Took their first real vacation in 40 years a week in Colorado, looking at mountains neither of them had seen before. The grandchildren came. Colleen had 2 boys. Marge had 3 kids, 2 girls and a boy. Willa had 1 daughter, Opal, born in 2004. The grandchildren visited during summers, learned to collect eggs and feed chickens and drive the truck in circles around the empty field behind the barn. They were city kids, mostly uncomfortable with silence and dirt under their fingernails, but they loved the farm in that uncomplicated way children love places that feel like adventure. Lorraine taught Opal how to make pie crust, how to can green beans, how to tell when bread dough had risen enough. The girl had Willa's dark hair and serious eyes, asked questions, constantly wanted to understand how everything worked. She was 12 years old in 2014 when she announced over Sunday dinner that she wanted to farm when she grew up. The table went quiet. Willa looked horrified. Clayton looked shocked. Lorraine felt something catch in her throat. "Why, sweetie?" She managed to keep her voice steady. "Because you and Grandpa look happy. My mom and Dad are always stressed about money. They fight about bills and credit cards and whether we can afford things, but you're not stressed. You're just
peaceful." Clayton set down his fork, stood up from the table. "Opal, let me show you something." They walked out to the shed together, grandfather and granddaughter. Lorraine watched through the window as Clayton opened the door to his small office, really just a corner of the machine shed with a desk and filing cabinet. He pulled out Vernon's old notebook, the one he'd kept in a drawer since his father died 29 years earlier. Opal read the pages slowly, carefully. Lorraine couldn't hear what Clayton was saying, but she could see his hands moving, pointing to entries, explaining things. When they came back inside half an hour later, Opal's face was thoughtful. "Grandpa Walter was really smart, wasn't he? Smartest man I ever knew." Clayton's voice was thick. "And I was too proud to listen when I should have." Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Lorraine asked Clayton what he'd told Opal. The truth. That farming can give you peace, but only if you do it right. That the goal isn't to get big or impressive. It's to be free. And you can't be free if you owe money to people who don't care whether you sleep at night. Lorraine leaned against his shoulder. They were sitting on the porch watching the sun set over fields that had been in his family for 91 years. Fields that had survived the Depression and the Dust Bowl and droughts and floods and the particular kind of damage that comes from human error and pride. "You think she'll really want to farm someday?" "Maybe. Or maybe she'll change her mind when she's older and realizes how hard it is. Either way, we showed her what it looks like to do it without destroying yourself. That's worth something." September of 2015 brought the kind of cleaning out that people do when they're getting older and starting to think about what happens to all their accumulated possessions after they're gone. Lorraine and Clayton spent a Saturday going through the machine shed, sorting tools and equipment into piles keep, sell, donate. 46 years of farming left a lot of debris. In the corner behind an old toolbox, Lorraine found a smaller metal box she didn't recognize. Opened it to find letters. Dozens of them. All addressed to Vernon, all in Estelle's handwriting dating from the 1940s through the early 80s. She sat down on an overturned bucket and started reading. Love letters from early in Vernon and Estelle's marriage. Practical letters from later years discussing farm decisions and household matters. And then near the bottom of the stack, one dated May 1975. "Dear Vernon, I know you're worried about Clayton buying that combine, but he's a grown man. He has to make his own mistakes. Just like you did in 47. What saved us wasn't that you never failed. It's that you learned from failure, and you never repeated it. Clayton will learn too. All we can do is love him while he does. Your Estelle." Lorraine read the letter 3 times, felt tears start to blur the words. She'd never known Estelle had written this. Never known that her mother-in-law had understood so clearly what was happening, had chosen to stay silent and let events unfold instead of interfering.
Clayton found her crying in the shed 20 minutes later. She handed him the letter without speaking, watched his face as he read it. She knew, his voice breaking on the words. The whole time, she knew what was going to happen, and she didn't say anything. What would she have said? That you needed to learn this lesson for yourself? That watching people you love make mistakes is part of loving them? Lorraine wiped her eyes. She did the hardest thing, Clayton. She stood back and let you fall, because she trusted you'd get back up. They stayed in the shed for a long time, reading through the other letters. Estelle's voice coming through across decades, patient and wise, and full of the kind of love that knows when to speak and when to keep silent. 2 years later, in the spring of 2018, Clayton's arthritis got bad enough that working full days became impossible. He was 75 years old. Lorraine was 77. They could still manage the farm with help, but barely. And Opal was only 14 years away from being ready to take over, assuming she still wanted to, when the reality of farming met the romance of it. They made the decision together, sitting at that same kitchen table where they'd made every other important decision in their marriage. Time to sell while they could still choose to, before health forced them, before they became a burden on their daughters who had their own lives to manage. The farm sold to a young couple named Doyle and Geneva Anderson, 32 and 30 years old respectively. 2 kids under 5. Dreams of expanding, buying adjacent land, building something significant. They'd secured a $280,000 loan from the bank, had plans to double the acreage within 5 years. Lorraine watched them sign the papers and saw Clayton and herself at that age. Saw the confidence that comes from not yet understanding how quickly things can go wrong. Saw the optimism that hasn't been tempered by watching markets collapse or equipment fail or weather destroy months of work in an afternoon. Doyle shook Clayton's hand after the closing. Mr. Mitchell, I'm planning to really scale this operation up. Double the acreage in 5 years, maybe more. Really make something of the land. Clayton glanced at Lorraine. She knew what he was thinking. Knew he was remembering Vernon trying to warn him about the combine. Knew he was deciding whether to offer advice that wouldn't be heard anyway. Lorraine spoke before Clayton could. Doyle, can I give you some advice? Of course, Mrs. Mitchell. The farm will teach you what you need to learn, but only if you're willing to listen. The land isn't the enemy. Debt is, as long as you remember that you'll be okay. Doyle smiled politely, the kind of smile that means thank you for your concern, but we've got this figured out. I appreciate that.
We've done our research, got a solid business plan. This is going to work out great. Lorraine nodded, didn't argue, just like Vernon hadn't argued with Clayton, just like Estelle hadn't argued with Vernon, because some lessons can't be taught. They can only be lived through. They bought a house in Hayes 3 months later, 1,200 square feet, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, paid cash from the sale of the farm. After 50 years in that drafty farmhouse with its creaking floors and unreliable heating, the small townhouse felt like luxury, climate-controlled, low maintenance, close to the grocery store and the library, and Ruth, who at 100 years old was still living independently in her bungalow on Main Street. The adjustment was harder than Lorraine expected. She'd spent half a century with work that needed doing, gardens to tend, meals to cook for harvest crews, chickens to feed, endless laundry from Clayton's work clothes. Now there were just the two of them in a small space with no land to manage and no animals to care for, and days that stretched out empty in ways that should have felt restful, but instead felt slightly unmoored. Clayton struggled too. Would wake at 5 out of habit, wander the small house looking for something to do, settle into the chair by the window, and stare out at a neighbor's yard trying to figure out who he was if he wasn't a farmer. It took time, months, maybe a year. But slowly they found new rhythms. Coffee on the porch in mornings, walks around town in afternoons, Tuesday visits with Ruth, Wednesday night church services. Clayton volunteered at the county extension office, answering questions for young farmers who were just starting out. Lorraine joined a quilting circle, finally learning properly the skill Estelle had tried to teach her decades ago. Thanksgiving of 2018 brought all 3 daughters home with their families, Colleen and David and their 2 grown sons, Marge and Mark and their 3 kids, including Opal, who is now 14 and still talking about farming, Willa and her husband Thomas and their daughter. 15 people crammed into the small house. Noise and chaos and the particular joy that comes from family gathered together. They ate turkey and stuffing and the pies Lorraine had made with Opal's help, talked about jobs and school and whose turn it was to host Christmas. After dinner, while the adults were cleaning up and the younger kids were watching a movie in the living room, Opal found Lorraine in the kitchen drying dishes. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" "Of course, honey." Opal's voice dropped to just above a whisper. "Why did you stay when things got really bad with the farm, when you and Grandpa were struggling? Why didn't you leave?" The kitchen went quiet. Colleen stopped mid-wipe on the counter. Marge paused with a handful of silverware. Willa turned from the sink,
All three daughters watching their mother waiting for an answer to a question they'd maybe wanted to ask themselves but never had. Lorraine set down the dish towel, looked at her granddaughter, this serious young woman with her whole life ahead of her trying to understand the choices other people make. Because leaving would have been easier. And I didn't marry him for easy. I married him for real. Real means you stay when it's hard. Real means you hold each other up. Real means sometimes you're the strong one and sometimes they are. She paused, chose her next words carefully because she wanted Opal to understand something important. Your grandfather made a big mistake with that combine, and I made a mistake not speaking up sooner. But we made those mistakes together, and we fixed them together. That's what for better or worse actually means. It doesn't mean you never mess up. It means you don't leave when the person you love messes up. You stay, you figure it out, you grow. Opal was crying, quiet tears running down her face. I hope I find that someday. Someone worth staying for. You will, Lorraine promised. If you remember that the best partner isn't someone who never fails, it's someone who learns from failure, and someone who loves you through yours. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, daughters and sons-in-law in the guest room and on the couch, grandchildren in sleeping bags on the floor, Lorraine and Clayton sat on the front porch wrapped in blankets against November cold. We did okay, didn't we? Clayton's breath made clouds in the air. Lorraine took his hand, the same hand that had reached for hers on their wedding day 51 years ago. The same hand that had held hers when Colleen was born and when they lost the combine and when Vernon died. The same hand that had learned finally to ask for help instead of carrying everything alone. We did better than okay. We did what your father hoped we'd do. We survived. We learned. And we're still here. He kissed her forehead. I love you, Lorraine Mitchell. I love you, Clayton. They sat in silence as the temperature dropped and stars came out over a town they'd lived near their entire adult lives, but were only now really inhabiting. Somewhere across town in the house Ruth had bought 30 years ago, a 100-year-old woman was probably still awake, probably reading or doing a crossword puzzle or thinking about the husband she'd lost 33 years earlier and still talked to sometimes when she was alone. Somewhere south of town on land that used to be theirs, Doyle and Geneva Anderson were probably asleep in the farmhouse where Lorraine had raised 3 daughters, probably dreaming about expansion plans and increased yields and all the ways they were going to make this work. Probably not thinking about what happens when hail comes or prices drop or equipment fails at the worst possible moment. They'd learn, or they wouldn't. Either way, it wasn't Lorraine's concern anymore. She'd played her part, raised her family, survived her mistakes, learned what Vernon had been trying to teach and passed it on to the next generation as best she could. The farm wasn't hers anymore. Hadn't been hers for months. But the lessons it taught about patience and perseverance and the high cost of pride, those were hers to keep. Those and the man sitting beside her who'd taken 40 years to understand what his father knew at 30, who'd nearly destroyed everything trying to prove he could do things differently, who'd finally learned that there's no shame in being cautious, no cowardice in choosing peace over growth, no failure in staying small if small means staying free. You cold? Clayton asked. A little. Want to go inside? Not yet. Let's stay a few more minutes. So they stayed, wrapped in blankets on the porch of a house they owned outright in a town where everyone knew their names. Stayed while the wind picked up and brought the smell of coming snow. Stayed while lights in neighboring houses went dark one by one. Stayed because they could. Because there was nowhere they had to be and nothing they had to prove and no debt chasing them into sleepless nights. The land they'd worked for 50 years was gone. The equipment was sold. The life they'd built around farming had ended. But they were still here, still together, still holding hands in the cold, and that Lorraine understood finally was the whole point. Not the farming itself, but what you became by doing it right. Not the legacy of land passed down, but the wisdom of learning when to hold on and when to let go. Vernon had known it. Estelle had known it. And now at 77 years old, sitting on a porch with the man she'd married when she was 28, and naive and full of dreams about what their life would look like, Lorraine knew it too. Sometimes keeping what matters most means letting go of everything else. Sometimes wisdom looks like a small house and a paid-off mortgage and the freedom to sit on your porch at night without worrying about what tomorrow brings. Sometimes the best inheritance you can leave isn't land or money or equipment that lasts for generations. Sometimes it's just the example of 2 people who made mistakes and learned from them, who fell down and got back up, who chose each other over pride, over property, over the 1,000 other things that seem important until you realize they're not. The wind carried the scent of turned earth from somewhere beyond town, someone preparing fields for spring planting, the cycle continuing without them as it should, as it always would. Lorraine leaned her head against Clayton's shoulder and closed her eyes and let herself feel grateful for ordinary things, for warmth and shelter and a partner who'd learned to listen, for daughters who'd chosen their own paths and grandchildren who asked hard questions,
For 50 years of marriage that had tested them in every way possible and left them here together, still choosing each other. "Ready now?" Clayton asked. "Yes, I'm ready." They went inside, locked the door, turned off the porch light.
Climbed into bed in their small house in their small town where nobody cared if they'd made money or lost it, if they'd succeeded or failed, if they'd built an empire or just survived. They'd survived, and in the end, that was enough.